And yeah, welcome to Duncan Brown. Duncan, very nice to see you. Thank you very much for coming along. Duncan's an independent advisor on rewards, having worked at Aon, Willis, Towers Watson, and IES, amongst others. He was Deputy CEO at the CIPD for 5 years, is the co-author of the Handbook of Reward Management, a visiting professor at the University of Greenwich, and on the boards of the Pensions Policy Institute, the High Pay Centre, as you're just saying there, and the IPA. So the plan for today is we're going to go on to 1 o'clock. There's going to be 20 minutes or so of thinking and ideas from Duncan. Then if time, we're going to have a couple of questions that we're going to pose to the group and get a couple of inputs from there, from you, and then another 20 minutes or so of thinking and ideas again from Duncan, with 10 minutes Q&A and discussion around some specific questions, with a hard finish at 1300. So do send us questions and suggestions via chat throughout. Duncan, I'll look after those. As I say, if you've not put yourself on mute already, please do. That would be much appreciated. And Duncan, over to you. Feel free to share your slides.
Richard, hi, and hello everyone, and thank you ever so much for inviting me along to this experts at work. I'm certainly at work. Whether or not I'm expert, you can kind of judge for yourselves once you've seen this. And also just to thank Richard particularly, in lieu of my usual outrageous fee for public speaking engagements. Richard's kindly made a donation to the Ukraine appeal. That just sums up the fella, I think. So thank you, Richard. I really appreciate that. But anyway, we're on a reward agenda, and I don't know whether this will disappoint you, but I think anyone who's tuning in, who's been involved like me in some pay negotiations recently, where you sit down with the trade unions and you look at a figure which says market pay awards from IDR or whatever are 3%. And when I was doing it last month, inflation was 6%. It's now 7%. How does 3% and 7% add up? Well, the answer is it doesn't. So I'm afraid if you're looking for an answer on that, you might as well tune out now, because I haven't got one any more than you have. But nonetheless, there's a lot of interesting things going on in pay and reward at the moment. I've probably been working in the area for, God, at least 30 years. And the fun bit is, although it's a bit hairy at the moment, there's things going on that I've never seen before. And so on some of this, your guess is at least an experience is at least as valuable as mine. But I wanted to share with you, really, I've done a couple of things. I've sort of pulled out some of the research I've done on what's been going on and how people have reacted to COVID. But then also, as we've progressed into this kind of, whatever you want to call it, cost of living crisis, whatever, there's clearly a whole pivot in terms of how people are reacting to that. And so I've tried to pull what I'm seeing there too, and really use it to highlight some of the areas of focus that I kind of am seeing with my clients, and see whether that aligns with yours. So let's get some slides up, as Richard says. Mr. G, HR final. We'll get back to the start. Okay, and as Richard said, we're going to kind of probably take a break in 20 minutes or so and just stop, and I'll come out of share so I can see you all and maybe see if you've got any questions. But I think there's so many kind of headlines and exclamation marks at the moment, and we're not quite sure, you know, we got a talent crisis, cost of living crisis. I see the IMF were predicting a possible recession in the UK by the end of the year, when we were actually on for record GDP growth at the start of the year. And clearly, one way of reacting to that is just stay very reactive. What I'm going to argue is we do want to put some strategies and priorities and stakes in the ground. But my God, they're going to have to be flexible the way things are moving at the moment. So that's my sort of agenda. And yeah, just to stick down on one slide, I guess, what I'm going to be arguing. That building there on the left is just off Smith Square in London. It's the NIESR office, where they had a threatened strike. The strike didn't occur over that dissonance between the pay award they were offered and the rate of inflation. And that was my office there on that sort of top right hand side window, because we used to share with them at IES. So even the economic forecasters can't agree at the moment. But what I'm going to argue is that the good thing coming out of COVID, if there is a good thing, was that it has pushed HR center stage. It's a human crisis. It's been, and the reward agenda is being very central to that, not just in terms of the obvious physical health, but also now all the work on mental health and well-being. The equality agenda has been really highlighted, and unfortunately inequality exacerbated. But it really has put, I think, what we're doing center stage on the business agenda. But we're now in this very unusual situation where even the economists can't agree what's going to happen. You know, those two issues, that we're never going to match price inflation at the moment with pay awards unless we're an investment bank or something, but also whatever you're paying, you're not going to be able to recruit people who aren't there. And clearly in some areas Brexit has led to labour shortages that were ongoing before Brexit, were ongoing before COVID, but now you know, if you're trying to get farm workers, for example, I wrote a case study up on a big farming cooperative recently. They're just not there. You can pay what you like, you're not going to get them, and so they've got to look at mechanisation and different ways of producing the stuff. And as I said, I think HR's done an amazing job in being in crisis mode over the last 3 years. But I think we need to be looking a bit more ahead now. And I'm going to argue, despite all the issues from the economic, the political situation, etc., we have choice here. We're in positions where we've got choices. And I would argue a big choice for us is, do we go back to that low cost, low responsibility employment model? I'll try not to mention P&O, but they're clearly heading back. But that was that sort of cost minimization contract out model has been a pretty common reaction in the last decade. Do we really want to go back to that, or do we really want to start pushing a shift towards a higher value added, higher pay economy that Boris talked about 6 months ago and we haven't heard much of since? And not surprisingly, I'm going to be arguing for the latter. Okay, so that's the gig in one slide. Let's get on with it. So almost now with inflation and everything, it seems easy to forget that it's only 2 years ago that that happened in the middle graph there. So that is the little red bit is the 2008 recession, which was bad enough at the time. But when COVID hit, we basically shut the economy down. So GDP fell by 10%, and that was a big shock, wasn't it? And it was, Christ, what do we do? What's furlough mean, etc. But as I say, and I'll show you, I think we did a pretty good job, particularly on the reward agenda, and government stepped in with the furlough type schemes, etc., extending sick pay and benefits and increasing benefits. Very much also a driver for some social movements, and this maybe sounds a little bit idealistic now, but a lot of stuff around, as the IMF said then, in addressing the health and economic crisis, we've got to cooperate, or else, as unfortunately Ukraine is illustrating, it is possible to make a dire situation even worse. So that was COVID. Now what's happened? We've gone from recession and stagnation to initially a very rapid GDP growth, or question if that's going to continue, and the Bank of England talking now about stagflation, this kind of low growth, high inflation environment. A lot of pressures now to deliver on ESG with the climate conference, etc. Rather than locking people out, there's still these supply log jams and shortages of everything, including labour. The Great Resignation, is that a feature of the UK? Are you worried about that? I'll be interested what your take on that is, because I'm a bit sceptical. But anyway, all the issues to do with hybrid working, now people are coming back to the office, and as I said, moving from a health to a cost of living crisis. 3/4 of FTSE 100 companies cited labour issues, primarily recruitment and retention problems, as principal risk to their business in their annual report and accounts. That is unheard of. I reckon if 10% in a typical year mention HRE stuff, it's a good year. So these issues are really affecting the survival and success of businesses. And as I'll show you a link to that autonomy report. It's also really put the spotlight maybe on some employment models that have got fairly popular in the UK. So just a few lessons from COVID. I'd argue HR's had a good pandemic, but I guess the question is, have our priorities shifted permanently towards the health and well-being of staff? Surprising one for me is that Rolls-Royce and Ferrari, Gucci, Verve, Glico, etc., have got record sales. And it was the chief exec of Rolls-Royce, actually, who's a German, who said, he explained that by saying, life is short. We've all seen folks near and dear to us get very seriously ill, and unfortunately some die. And it does make you think, what am I going to do with my life? So we might not have anticipated that. M&S share price, it's now worth more than Boohoo, which again is, bricks and mortar was supposed to be outdated, wasn't it, before COVID hit? But on an employment front, as I said, HR's had a good pandemic, but I think the equality agenda took a back seat, and the poor and protected groups have really been hit hardest. I'm going to question whether a great resignation is really going on. At IES, we call it the missing million rather than the great resignation. Bank of England themselves have talked about spiralling wages. I'm going to say it's much more a cost of living catastrophe. And then if your chief executive said at some point during COVID, we're all in this together, I just want to put a little question mark on that. Okay, the original great, the plague was described by Defoe as the great leveler. Rich and poor alike got it. This has been the great unleveler. Low-income workers, women, ethnic minority groups have suffered worst. If you look at the mortality stats, it's occupations such as carers, which have the worst mortality rates there, heavily female, heavily overrepresented Black and minority ethnic. The Commons Women and Equality Committee, Caroline Noakes in the news this week, she chairs it, have done some fantastic research to highlight that COVID highlighted and exacerbated existing inequalities. And the Marmot report, which did a bit of 10 years ago, actually in 2010, it did a health map of the UK, which pretty much correlated ill health with low income levels. It also maps now very much with where the worst mortality rates from COVID were. And as I said, the equality agenda seems to have taken a bit of a back seat. The gender pay gap has widened. Around a third of companies miss their target of representation on the boards and are behind on the Parker ethnicity targets. So not a great couple of years really from an equality point of view. So yes, it's been an unequal pandemic. What about the Great Resignation? Recruitment, retention issues, major. If you look at the CIPD survey, last one on it, 80% of employers reported recruitment difficulties due to Brexit as well as the pandemic, and as I said, some predating both. like drivers, HGV drivers, and about half report fewer retention difficulties. While in the US you've got evidence of high voluntary quit rates, in the UK the ONS doesn't produce great stats on voluntary labour turnover. It's basically gone up, but not out of line with a normal economic growth period. And the bigger issue, I think, is that around 1 million people, we've got 1 million people less actually working. And they haven't gone to become unemployed, they've gone into other categories. So this category of economically inactive, which is much bigger now than unemployment, that's what I've mapped over on that graph on the right. And you can see how it's grown each quarter during COVID. And number of phases. First, it was lockdowns and people not working. Then, as often happens in recession, young people decide, well, there aren't any jobs, so I'll go and study. So you had a big growth in students. But now the issue has been growth in those who can't work due to ill health and the over 50s. So now as I said, we've got 1 million fewer workers in the labour force, and those are largely due to ill health, young people not coming into the labour market, or over 50s no longer in work, that's been the major contributor to this issue. So where there is voluntary resignation, the data is kind of mixed. A big study using federal stats by Donald Soll at Harvard basically says non-pay reasons are the major issues. So that the analysis they've done says a toxic corporate culture is 10 times as influential as pay on people leaving, as well as things like job insecurity, 0 hours contracts, etc., which are far more widespread in the US even than here. But another big study, the Pew Research, well-recognized US do a regular polling of US workers, and they've highlighted pay in careers as being the main reasons for people moving. So probably a mix of things. If you look in the UK, we're pretty low on the engagement stats generally. Europe's the lowest. When I was at Aon Hewitt, Europe was the low performer in the world, and we still are. And the UK is low even for Europe. So we have low levels of engagement. COVID seems to have neither affected them generally up or down, really, just changed the readings. And if you look at our largest employer, the NHS, who have reportedly the biggest annual staff survey in the world, they've got pretty flat engagement levels. Pride in the employer and in the care that NHS provides has, well, you might be surprised or not, and that's gone up. But now we're seeing loss of enthusiasm, burnout, feeling less involved in work, feeling more stress, and people's health and well-being in the sector suffering, meaning that more people are thinking about leaving and more people are probably going. And I suspect in many of your organisations that may be the pattern as well. We have also got a real cost of living crisis. The Resolution Foundation, Torsten, called it a catastrophe. And there's no doubt really that I don't think that's exaggerating. Why have we got that? Well, funny enough, during COVID, real pay often increased because the majority of furloughed employees, the 20% cut in pay under the original school, was made up to 100% by the majority of employers. Well done, everyone who did that, protecting their employees. And it also, of course, even 12 months ago, inflation was only 0.7%, so it was historically low. There is data, though, showing bigger sector regional gaps in pay, and you've got the same at the moment. So the public sector pay is moving at only about 1.5% at the moment, whereas in professional services, it's more like 9-10%. So it's, yeah, but what there's no doubt that even though pay awards have gone up, Expert HR's March data, they said they've inched up to 3% median. The ONS data is 4%, but that includes overtime, and 5% if you include bonuses. But you know, that's not going to reflect a situation of 7% inflation, and the OBR forecasting between 9 and 10% by year end, and even upper quartile awards are only 4%. And you know, because of now the uncertainty, I don't know whether you saw last week that survey from the Chartered Management Institute. I think it's mostly finance directors, but a third were concerned about their financial performance, and a half say they may not be able to make pay rises at all this year. And that's so where we get the cost of living issue. Average estimate is around 1,100 quid per employee, a 4% real pay cut. That's unheard of since, you know, we had real pay cuts for much of the last decade, but that's the biggest. I think modern records began in the mid-50s, so that's the biggest since then. And again, the poor are suffering worse from this. So inequality is widening, largely because richer folk have more of their assets in capital. So 40% of London employers are worried about poverty in their workforce, absolute levels of poverty. So yeah, definitely a priority in all of your reward strategies. And finally, looking at this, all in this together, sorry, I don't mean to have a go at BP. There'll be plenty of chief executives who made similar sentiments during COVID. About a third of the FTSE actually did cut pay, typically in alignment for their executives, in alignment with the furlough reductions. But those were made back up pretty quick. And generally, the long-term incentive, the biggest chunk of executive remuneration, hasn't been affected. And I guess some real controversy over companies that took furlough money, but continued to pay executive bonuses. And again, I'm not having a go at particular companies. They, you know, I just put some illustrations there, but there were plenty of others. So I think. And again, I think with social media now, these inconsistencies are getting increasingly called out. If you're saying support for Black Lives Matter, but you're not publishing your ethnicity pay gaps, people are going to call that out now in a way that maybe they wouldn't have done 5 years ago. So what's the future ahead? The Chancellor clearly still feels we've got an age of optimism, and GDP has surpassed the pre-COVID levels, which it still hasn't in some countries in Europe. We're a bit more negative on an IES front, and the IMF are pretty negative at the moment, and the wars made them even more negative. Or you might be concerned, did you see that survey yesterday that 80-odd% of HR directors are worried about stress and overwork in their HR departments. So you may be worried about that more than anything. But you know, I think this question about are we going back to the situation that was pre-COVID, where you had over 1 million workers in insecure arrangements on zero contracts, 5 million folk working for less than a real living wage. Pay differentials widening once again, poverty levels going up, and the majority of kids in poverty now don't have unemployed parents, they live in working households, and the weakest in society really suffering the most. You know, state sick pay levels just shown to be totally inadequate really, and the trend in corporate schemes had also been to reduce sick pay benefits. Do we want to go back for that? So let's just stop here, and I guess some more philosophical questions really from that, which I've been reflecting on. You know, what personally and professionally have you learned from COVID? What's been the best and worst things for you? And you know, does it give you more optimism or pessimism about the world of employment? And insofar as you're optimistic, how much are you prepared now to push out and make some changes? in areas like poverty, inequality, perhaps in a way that HR hasn't really mainstreamed in the past. How far have things really changed? To what extent are we going to go back to normal, whatever normal is?
Thanks, Duncan. So I'd love to hear from a couple of you there. So it's the best and worst things about the pandemic and learning for the future, I guess. So what's the sort of the best thing that's come out of it for you, either personally or professionally for HR? What's the worst thing? And going forward, what next? Just raise a hand if you'd like to come in or dip in.
Sorry, that was a lot of stuff to chuck at you, and there, so it's like a fire. You suddenly switch your fire hose off, and then suddenly say, "Okay, what do you think?"
No, there's Kevin and Karina coming. Kevin, you first, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best thing is something Duncan touched on quite early on, is that appreciation of the people side of things now. You know, the HR agenda, the well-being, and all of that. I think a lot of employers have really stepped up to the plate and really put employee well-being at the forefront of a lot of their decisions now, whereas before, I'm not saying that didn't happen before, but I don't think it was as prominent, and I didn't think it was I think maybe it was undervalued how important that was. I mean, some of the stats maybe don't show. I mean, you talked about the engagement and the lack of. So I think from a positive perspective, certainly that. Negative perspective, I don't know. I mean, it's given us a big challenge at the moment in terms of return to office, hybrid working. You know, it's a real hot topic across all of government at the moment, as you can imagine. So that, you know, that's posing a lot of challenges. It's an opportunity as well, I think, because it's, you know, it's a different way of working, and how can you best utilize it. But from a HR professional perspective, it's on the verge of leading to some quite difficult conversations at the moment, because there's expectations from our senior leaders as to how often people should be in the office, and it's kind of weighing up that you should be in office this many days, but we've got to make it worth your while as well. There's no point coming to the office all day if you're just going to be on Teams. And it's going to take us a bit of time, I think, to find that balance. It's a bit of trial and error, as it was when we went into lockdown. Some things worked, some things didn't, so we had to adapt. You know, Teams wasn't anything like it is now when you look back 2 years ago. But I think there's maybe less patience to do that, and more of a drive to to not force people, obviously, but more of a drive to push that return to office and hybrid agenda, I think.
Yeah, it's the thing that people need convincing about, isn't it, Kevin? Thank you. That's a really good summary. We'll go to Karina, Jen, and then Laura, and then back to Duncan. So, Karina, all yours.
Yeah, so I think for me, the best things that came out of the pandemic is it's definitely shifted our world in terms of flexibility. And I think HR people had been talking for a long time about the potential benefits of giving people more flexibility around home working, things like that. And I think the pandemic kind of really forced that agenda, but also business leaders then more generally have woken up to the fact that actually giving people that flexibility can work really, really well for the business, and it can create great productivity gains for the business, albeit that there are then some issues that you have to manage. And I think alongside that, the way that it's pushed technology on as well has been a real positive. For me, probably the negative is probably come from the things that you highlighted, Duncan, around how it's really driven inequality in society and the social impact of it. And I think particularly in our business, we're really seeing the impact of that. It's almost the majority of people that we recruit now, when they're joining us, they're disclosing at very, very early stages that they struggle with mental health problems or anxiety. I would say that is the majority rather than the minority. So we are seeing a huge impact on that. And I firmly believe that this huge explosion in mental health problems, anxiety, stress is very, very much the sort of stuff that's going on. For me, I think the key learning has been just, you know, for sort of probably the last 2 kids, I think I've been writing about the pace of change. And in the little world of, parcels in the West Midlands, yes, the pace of change, I'm sure, is ramping up. We've got some new technologies, but I think it's brought that into focus in a really, really different way. Going into the pandemic 2 years ago, I had no idea that the world was going to look like it looks right now. And it's really honed for me that fact that we've got to be looking for the skills to cope with that and manage that in the future. It changes skills and knowledge requirements and makes you think more creatively, I think, about what your future skills and knowledge requirements are going to be when the world is evolving so fast. Am I optimistic about employment improvements? I'd like to be, because I'm generally a really optimistic person, but I think there's some stuff that needs to kind of get sorted out in Europe at the moment, and we need to kind of see how things are going to pan out this year, really. But I hope so. I hope that what we're seeing here is some drivers for change which will result in long-term improvements.
Thanks, Karina. I like that a lot. I like your point about the it sort of almost forces you or obliges you to consciously think about your learning going forward. And actually, it's actually the actual doing of that, isn't it, really, which is important. Thanks, Karina. That's great. And Jen?
Oh, okay, going third's not easy, is it? Because those were really great points that were made. And I'm sorry, I haven't got my picture on because I'm living the high life of hybrid working and walking the dog whilst being on this call. You're not going to see me, I'm afraid. But anyway, I would say, because I saw the cutting edge of COVID in the airline industry. So I would say one of the positives is actually we dispelled a lot of theory. There's things that couldn't work, but we also got our leaders off the pot on a number of business issues which they were too reticent to address. I'm not saying all of it was positive, because if you look at some of the results of that, I suspect unions will at one point or another come back on the companies like British Airways for basically holding them to account for what they had to do to save the business in that moment. But I genuinely think that businesses looked at their efficiencies, looked at how to operate better, but did it mostly in a mindful way. Things I worry about, I think it's the fact that we need to throw the rule book out on the number of things. So this call's really helpful for me because I work in a relatively small company, but I just find things that worked before the pandemic just are not helpful at the moment. So whether it's a reward strategy, reward benchmarking, it's a lot of stuff that I'm just going, actually, I'm not even sure this has got a place in the current climate, let alone for the future. So I'm kind of challenging myself a lot at the moment about, actually, do we actually throw out bonuses completely and put it onto base salary? Because people need the money each month. They don't want a hypothetical hope of 10% or something at the end of the year. So that I think it creates more, well, it creates creativity, doesn't it? Because we all have to think slightly different in a very odd market that we're now in. So they were my two reflections, if that's helpful.
Yeah, very helpful. Always helpful, Jen. Thank you. I like the point about creativity a lot. I think, yeah, that's right. It's given us a real platform for that. What's your dog's name?
Oh, he's called Finn. He's a Springer Spaniel that's got a broken off switch. So it doesn't matter how long I'm walking for, it's never enough.
Spaniels don't come with an off switch. Thanks, Jen, and thank you, Finn. Laura.
Thanks, Richard. Just a couple of points, and really it was Kevin going first that kind of triggered some of my ideas, I suppose. I think for me, one of the key benefits of HR, and certainly kind of my experience, was that the kind of the setting off of the pandemic really brought HR to the table in a world where we were already, or certainly in my role, I was already at the table, with the leadership team, but I feel like it put a spotlight on HR leaders really having to kind of guide the business through what was happening and kind of help them refocus and put people at the absolute kind of paramount of everything that they were trying to deliver. For me, that was also probably the hardest challenge as well, that actually suddenly HR, myself or colleagues across the Chief People Officer group were expected to have a lot of answers to things that we'd never really thought about before, and there wasn't a playbook for how to suddenly get everyone that needs a reasonable adjustment equipment, get that to their houses, and also make sure it's still in the office for them should they need to come in, and lots of other things that just you know, we were continuously being asked about kind of support to utility bills and just all sorts of things that you really hadn't had to think about in any great level of detail previously. Suddenly, you know, obviously everyone was having their own individual experience of the pandemic, and everyone had their own really important questions that they needed answering at pace. And so whilst it was, I think, you know, obviously the pandemic was, you know, horrific, but whilst it was great to bring kind of people leadership and people experience right to the forefront of our everyday deliverables, I think it was also a real challenge for colleagues in CPO to kind of work up the exact level of support that each individual and each business leader needed to kind of work through it the best way possible. But I hope, kind of keeping on theme, that the learning from that, I mean, for us, it certainly seems that there never is a moment to just stop and take a breath and reflect on what happened and how it all felt. But I really hope that we will do that properly, because I think that there's a lot that we learn. You know, we often talk about working agile in an agile way, and I feel like that really was kind of the best example that I've ever seen of it in practice. And I really hope that actually, should we need to prepare for anything else as dramatic, that we'd have a really good set of kind of evidenced ways that we worked through particular issues that we could fall back on.
Yeah, very nice, Laura. I like that a lot. As there's 2 points I take from that personally, is the whole with opportunity comes great responsibility.
Yeah.
Probably quite a fair bit of stress, to say the least. And secondly, have we actually taken the time to reflect on it? Have we had the time yet? Good call out there. Thanks to all four of you for bringing further to life exactly what Duncan was saying. Much appreciated. Duncan, back to you. Any thoughts on that, and in terms of the further presentation as well, of course?
I just want to listen to more of those. Goodness. Yeah, much better. But I think particularly that you've captured that kind of, you know, traditionally a lot of practice, it kept me in a living, was just look at what the market's doing, that's set what you're doing, and business alignment, the senior people telling us what to do on HR as if they know, and that's been chucked out, I think. And I loved your expression, Jen, get off the pot on it. I think we put the pressure on the business on some of these areas like flexible working to actually practice what we preach, and actually make bloody progress. You know, we've had research showing the productivity benefits from flexible working for years. Well, now we bloody did it, and we're getting more evidence. So, you know, why are we getting this stuff about we want everyone back in the office? And, you know, that's scary. Innovation's bloody scary, and creativity. But, you know, I'm so proud of, you know, I got a mate, they got a financial education wellbeing website up in 3 weeks. I'd have said bloody 3 months minimum, you know. It probably killed half of his team, but, you know, I'm so proud of the way some of we reacted. But these issues, you know, my the mental well-being, you know, my daughter, sort of high achiever, whatever, she's been off for 2 years with anxiety and stress now. It really does kind of impact, doesn't it? You really see that impact. And I agree, we've talked about mental health and financial well-being and put the choices in our menus and stuff, but well, now we're really having to practice it, and I think that's a really positive thing about this, even if the experience has been bloody awful for so many people. Okay, let's put, I definitely want to get some more chat, Richard, so I'm going to fire hose you with a wee bit more in terms of some of the stuff I'm seeing in terms of how people are prioritizing a strategy at the moment, what they're doing, because as you say, there's at least as immediate crises to address now as there was at the start of COVID. That's the pattern. If you look at the CIPD's talent survey, that's the pattern of, this was sort of turn of the year of responses to, on the left there you've got recruitment difficulties, and on the right you've got retention difficulties. I've got copies of this stuff, so we'll put that round in a PDF. But again, I'm really proud with this, that it's not just push the pay button. You'll see pay in the kind of middle of both tables, but rather than just throwing money at issues, with about a third of employers doing stuff on pay. But we've got a lot of work around development, around careers, around flexible working, recognizing that, as all the research says, recruitment and retention once you get above a surprisingly low level of financial reward, that's not why people leave. Yeah, really good pattern of responses there, I would argue, in terms of being backed up by research evidence of what does keep and motivate people. But I've got about 2 minutes on each, so I'll talk about 5 areas and then we'll get back to you talking. Reward strategies and workforce planning, health and well-being we talked a bit about, low pay and progressing people's skills and pay, the diversity stuff, that was really interesting that you're seeing that as well. And I really think we're going to have to push to keep that now on the agenda, given the new crises. And just a bit around what the evidence I'm seeing is saying works and doesn't work. Okay, you need a workforce and a people plan, I would argue, despite this immediate pressures. I guess the research I did just before COVID on HR strategies found that more of them were getting called people strategies, and that wasn't just terminology. I think they were much more values based. They were much more about developing people. I think already we were seeing the shift from buying in expensive external talent to developing, growing your own more. That's been really driven now in the labour short environment, but also a workforce plan. What's your local employment market? Where are people going to come from? I think that the businesses that were really badly affected by Brexit were already getting onto this. We need a clear plan of where our labour is going to come from, not just sort of we'll kind of hire in people if we lose people. And so those employment and labour market studies, not just pay studies. Pay is the end point. If pay is increasing, that's due to factors in the labour market. And so you can't understand pay without understanding the labour market. And the CIPD, again, has got some good guides in that area now. If you haven't got a workforce plan, if you're a small business or whatever, they've got some really neat material in that area. Get a reward strategy. One of my kind of free contributions during the pandemic was get a group of mates together, and my cat actually came in at regular occasions during our online meetings. Yeah, I put, if you Google rewards after the pandemic charter, you can get this very much a guidance in terms of how, despite all we've got going on, can you get a few priorities for rewards, get a few principles down there, get those agreed, and those will help your decisions and prioritization. So I haven't got time to go through those now, but just some basic questions. What's working, what isn't? What do we think good is in reward? To what extent do our current practices not deliver on that? And those questions I've just asked you about, what have we learned on pay and reward from the last 3 years? Because yeah, it's been a lot, certainly for me, a lifetime's worth of learning. Well-being, yeah, you mentioned mental health, etc. There's a ton of studies which actually show, comparing the kind of exploitative approach to people management, if you like, cost minimization, and the invest in people's well-being. Unfortunately, the vast majority of those studies show those investments pay off. And benefits has been reborn. What was it? Debbie O'Donovan at Reba said, you know, boring benefits are back. So we've certainly seen that cutting sick pay is a dumb policy. So about 1/5 of employers have improved it. EAP, you know, massively extended and improved in many employers. We've got into areas that maybe we would have said, oh, that's not an employer's responsibility, like domestic abuse, with real benefits. Again, I'm so proud of what some employers have done in that area. And benefits equity. You know, why have senior people, say, got private medical insurance when the people on the front line, who were the ones exposed to COVID, have got nothing? And statutory sick pay of 96 quid a week or whatever it is. So driven now both by the kind of labour shortages and some of the values now in employer values and HR strategies, we're seeing really a lot of investment in benefits, and 2/3 of people saying that's not going to be reversed. that we've got that into the bloodstream now, and that the end of the pandemic, anyway, if not COVID, isn't going to reverse that, which I agree with you is really good news. I think skills and progression. Get yourselves a learning strategy focused on internal development. Interesting case study of Bank of America, which moved in this direction because of IT shortages well before COVID, and it's really paid off. They're filling the majority of their IT vacancies now from internal development. But I think the career and pay progression, really important as well, with those figures on poverty. You know, and the CIPD, again, who would have thought they would have had that? I don't know whether you've seen it, just launched last month, a great website area on tackling in-work poverty. Go and have a look at it. It's brilliant. You know, do you even know if you've got poor folk in your workforce? Some employers don't. And yeah, we did some research around Europe on this at IES about just the payoff of progressing low paid workers through a career ladder, through regular pay progression. It really does pay off in so many settings. And I'd love to hear from some of you what you're doing on that area. As the CIPD says, you know, pay a living wage, have a financial well-being policy, and offer progression to everyone, not just high potentials. Those are seem to be the three keys to this. Okay, moving swiftly on, the equality agenda. Yeah, unfortunately, that's been one of the effects of the pandemic, to widen inequality, but Black Lives Matter and similar movement have really put the spotlight. And yeah, I love that expression, get off the pot. I think a lot of employers, there's some interest. Go and have a look at Starbucks diversity policy. It's really interesting. I've kind of had a love-hate relationship with Starbucks over my career, probably more of the latter, but it's an interesting commitment, including executive pay tied to diversity targets. Certainly very wide-ranging. But you know, there's a lot of evidence now on what works on progressing your diversity and particularly that ethnicity equality agenda. You know, are you still asking allowing current salary to affect recruitment decisions on pay? Are you having compulsory representative selection panels? The Rooney Rule, some of you, but I haven't got time to talk about it now, but sort of insisting on minority representation on shortlists for key posts. Controversial area, different impacts in different areas, but I certainly think we've got to start looking at tougher actions, because the traditional HR runs some equality training. It isn't working. It just isn't working. And as I said, there's a lot of research, and I can point you in that direction. And we've got some links in here you can have. Fairness between top and bottom. Real questions about the senior pay model for those of you involved in that, and organisations like High Pay Centre and the Purposeful Company are putting out a much more collective model, with collective more like a John Lewis type incentive structure than an executive incentive structure. And we've seen a big growth in employee-owned trusts and all employee share plans since COVID hit, and that's really positive. I think the evidence is that collective incentives have a much more positive impact than individual ones. And finally, just what's the evidence saying on what makes a difference? And now I think this is where, if we're to keep some of the gains and priorities we achieved during COVID, we've got to produce the evidence that they work. And again, that's great. I think that I know a number of your organisations have got research underway on, let's have a look at flexible working. Let's compare locations with different arrangements and see what the impact is. I think that's been real progress as a result of some of these real innovations that we're seeing now. And, you know, we can't act on any of these without data. So, you know, you should be publishing it. Don't like to be dictatorial, but, you know, you should be publishing your ethnicity as well as your gender pay stats, even if it's not compulsory. We won't address those issues unless we understand them. So I guess that's the situation. there is the opportunity to change, as Linda Grattan says. You know, it's really shaken things up, and my God, that's uncomfortable at times. I know we've all felt that. My God, like you're flying on or skating on thin ice. But there are opportunities from that, and I guess, you know, that's the question. Have we got the courage now? And maybe, you know, there's lots of other. I've been, again, really proud of HR's response to the Ukraine situation in some of my clients. We're always going to have those sort of crises, hopefully not as bad, but that doesn't stop us from really saying, what do we really believe in and how are we going to progress that agenda? And really good examples of innovation are just a few I picked up. You know, the Body Shop, instead of sort of, you know, the usual recruitment process, their response to staff shortages was get rid of selection, essentially, in a number of their US warehouses, just really hire on a first come first served basis. And guess what? If you do that, people are really grateful. Turnover drops, recruitment costs drop, and performance goes up. So they're trying it now in a number of stores as well. Collective defined contribution pensions, CDCs. If you don't know about those, have a Google. Pensions Policy Institute's got a really good guide. Became legal in the pensions bill. Really nice balance of DC between DB and DC, really. I think those have got a lot of mileage now in the economy we've got going forward. Look at collective incentives, share schemes, and employee ownership. You probably saw that thing about Citigroup putting bankers in Malaga in a new location. Really interesting. So they're only paying those folk half what they pay analyst recruits in London. They're looking for a different category of person and much more diverse than the people they recruit in the city. Yeah, they've really looked at the model. They feel it's attractive and cost effective. So I think that sort of innovation to address labour shortages, rather than, as we've seen in some of the professional firms, just constantly bidding up 100k for graduate recruits, etc., is crazy. So as Nita says, you know, if you're ever gonna, if things are ever being shaken up and you need to, you fancy having an experiment, try it, because I think those traditional approaches are there, have been challenged. And so finally, you know, I think those are some of the questions I'm working on with clients at the moment. How we're responding to skill shortages. Have we got a plan on that, and a retention policy? You know, the investment banks and consultancies were the only people I've seen with retention policies, but I think a lot more businesses would look at that. How do we really develop our own staff and build rather than just buying in? And what 3 things do you think you need to do really to take this opportunity to improve the world of employment and reward? So thank you. That was a bit of a rush at the end there, but thanks. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Any final comments would be great.
Yeah, as Duncan says, questions or reactions from everyone in the group would be much appreciated. Duncan, I was going to ask you actually if you could put the slides back up and have a look at slide 18, because there's quite a bit there that there might be some more questions about. That was the reward one specifically. But everyone on the call, that might not be where you want to go, so please raise your hand and we'll come to you.
Sorry. Slide 18. That one.
18, yeah, that one, yeah. It's just because it was particularly on reward, just in case there was anything else to say on that, or other questions that people would like in the last 4 minutes we've got or so. Does that make sense to people? It looks like a very good list to me, but is that the sort of thing that people have been working with?
Yeah, if you download the full thing, it's not long, it's about 10 pages, but it's just got a more detailed list of kind of questions and a structure for a reward strategy that you might want to take to your senior folk to discuss and get endorsed.
Yeah, okie doke. Good stuff. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a particularly useful slide. I'm rather in awe of your ability to get through such a rich presentation at speed without it seeming rushed until you said it was rushed. It was
Not letting any interruptions, that's what it is.
Well, I think people are having to get on to other things. So, Duncan, pleasure as ever working with you. Thank you so much. Really nice to see everybody, and thank you for making that such a rich discussion. We'll see you at the next event soon. Thanks for the reactions there, much appreciated. Duncan, always a pleasure. Stay on the line and we can see some of the feedback, Mr. Brown, and we'll see everyone again soon. Thank you.
Right, thanks everyone. Thank you, Richard. A real pleasure to be with you.
You.
Oh, just going to stop recording.